Jonathan Harper had spent 3 years believing one undeniable truth: Catherine had abandoned them. She had walked out of their lives without a word, leaving him to pick up the pieces and raise their daughter alone. He had learned to live with that reality, to bury the pain, to convince himself that she wasn't worth the space in his mind. But all of that shattered the moment he saw her. Standing in the entrance of the restaurant, Catherine looked exactly the same and yet completely different. She wasn't a ghost from his past, she was real, flesh and blood, staring at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. And then she spoke. "Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Everything inside him screamed to walk away, to shield Sarah from whatever this was. But before he could react, a small voice beside him cut through the tension. "Mommy?" And just like that, his carefully built world began to crumble. Jonathan Harper had built his life around certainty. As the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, he was a man who thrived on control, structure, and logic. There was no room for unpredictability in his world, no space for emotions to cloud his judgment. That was why, 3 years ago, when his wife Catherine disappeared without a trace, he had done what he did best: adapted, rebuilt, and moved forward. At first, he had searched for her. He had hired the best private investigators, sent inquiries to every possible contact, and even considered the idea that something terrible might have happened to her. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, with no trace of her ever surfacing, the conclusion became painfully clear. She had left them. She had walked away from their marriage, from their home, and worst of all, from their daughter, Sarah, who had been only 3 years old at the time. Jonathan had been forced to accept a truth he never imagined he would face. He was a single father now. The realization had been a heavy one, but he had no choice but to push forward. He had made mistakes in the beginning, struggling to balance boardroom negotiations with preschool pickups, late-night feedings with early-morning investor meetings. But over time, he had learned. He had figured out how to be both a powerful businessman and a devoted father, even when exhaustion threatened to consume him. Sarah had been his priority from the moment Catherine vanished. He had promised himself that he would never let her feel unloved, never let her question whether she mattered. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, there were moments when he saw it in her eyes, the silent, unspoken pain of a little girl who had been abandoned by the person who was supposed to love her most. One night, when she was 4, she had asked him the question he had feared the most. "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" Jonathan had frozen. He had spent years handling the most difficult business negotiations, had stood in front of shareholders and defended multi-million-dollar decisions without hesitation, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had wanted to tell her that her mother loved her, that there had been some mistake, but how could he say that when he didn't believe it himself? So he had told her the truth, or at least, the truth as he had come to understand it. "Some people leave, sweetheart," he had said gently, brushing a stray curl from her face. "And sometimes, they don't come back. But that doesn't mean you're not loved. I love you more than anything." Sarah had simply nodded, curling into his chest, and Jonathan had held her, feeling the weight of the promise he had just made. He would be enough for her. He had to be. Now, 3 years later, Sarah was 6, and their world had settled into a rhythm. She no longer asked about her mother. It was as if she had learned to live with the absence, just as Jonathan had. They had created their own little world, just the two of them, and he had convinced himself that they didn't need anyone else. That illusion shattered on a quiet evening when everything changed. Jonathan had planned a special night for Sarah. She had received her first school award, a certificate for being the most helpful student in her class, and he had promised her a celebration. She had been beaming with pride all afternoon, clutching the piece of paper like it was made of gold, and Jonathan had decided that, for once, they would do something different. Instead of their usual home-cooked dinner, he had taken her to an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, a place he usually reserved for business meetings. The evening had started perfectly. Sarah had been full of excitement, swinging her legs under the table as she chattered about her friends, her teacher, and how she had helped a classmate tie their shoes. Jonathan had listened, smiling as he watched the light in her eyes. These were the moments he cherished most, the ones where he felt like he was doing something right. Then, in the middle of their conversation, Sarah suddenly stopped talking. Her expression froze, her big blue eyes widening as she stared past him toward the entrance of the restaurant. Jonathan frowned, following her gaze. And then he saw her. Catherine. For a split second, he thought he was imagining things. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, because it wasn't possible. She was gone. She had been gone for 3 years. And yet, she was standing there, in the doorway of the restaurant, looking exactly the same as the last time he had seen her. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to exist in their world anymore. And yet, there she was. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he knew she had come back. But why? And what could possibly be left to say after all this time? Jonathan felt as if the entire restaurant had gone silent. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversations, the soft notes of the piano in the background, all of it faded into the background as his mind locked onto one impossible sight. Catherine. The woman he had convinced himself was gone forever, the woman he had spent 3 years trying to forget, the woman who had abandoned their daughter without a word. And yet, here she was, standing just a few feet away, looking at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. His body tensed instinctively, his grip tightening on the table's edge as a rush of emotions surged through him: shock, anger, confusion, disbelief. He wanted to stand up, to demand answers, to ask her how she had the audacity to show up like this after everything. But before he could move, a small voice cut through the tension. "Mommy?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to shatter what little control he had over the situation. Jonathan's eyes snapped to his daughter, whose tiny hands were clenched in her lap, her eyes round with uncertainty. He could see the conflict playing out on her face, the flicker of recognition, the hesitation, the desperate hope that she wasn't imagining things. Catherine took a hesitant step forward, and Jonathan immediately rose from his seat, placing a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. His voice was low, measured, but laced with unmistakable anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" Catherine flinched at his tone, her gaze dropping briefly before she lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "I need to talk to you." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? You think you can just walk in here after 3 years and talk?" His voice was sharp, controlled, but the fury underneath it was barely restrained. "You don't get to do that, Catherine. You don't get to just show up." Sarah looked between them, confusion clouding her innocent face. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Jonathan softened slightly, kneeling beside her, keeping his body between her and Catherine. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently. "Finish your dinner. I'll be right back." Sarah hesitated, but she nodded, though her eyes stayed locked on Catherine. Jonathan took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his emotions in check, then turned back to the woman he had once loved and gestured toward the entrance. "Outside. Now." He led the way through the restaurant, his jaw clenched as he pushed open the doors and stepped into the cool evening air. The city buzzed around them, cars passing, people walking by, lights glowing from the high-rise buildings, but in that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that existed was the woman standing before him and the million unanswered questions burning inside him. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of his gaze. "Jonathan, Don't," he snapped. "Don't you dare stand here and act like this is normal. Like you didn't disappear for 3 years without a single word. Like you didn't leave our daughter behind." His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerously close to pain. Catherine swallowed hard, her eyes glistening under the streetlights. "I never wanted to leave." Jonathan let out another harsh laugh. "That's the best you've got? That's what you came here to say? Because from where I'm standing, You made your choice pretty damn clear when you walked out that door 3 years ago." Tears welled in her eyes, but he refused to let himself feel anything for them. Not after what she had done. Not after what she had put their daughter through. "I was taken," she whispered. For a moment, Jonathan didn't react. The words didn't register, didn't make sense. He stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, waiting for the lie to come unraveling. "What?" His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. Catherine inhaled shakily. "I didn't leave you. I was taken. I was kidnapped, Jonathan." His breath caught in his chest, his entire body going rigid. His mind immediately rejected the possibility. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw something he hadn't before. The slight tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders hunched as if she had been carrying a burden too heavy to bear, the way her breath hitched as she forced herself to meet his gaze. And for the first time, doubt crept in. His voice was hoarse when he spoke again. "Prove it." Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at Catherine, waiting for her to break, to admit that this was some desperate attempt at an excuse. The idea that she had been taken, that she hadn't simply abandoned them, was too impossible to believe. But as he watched her, something inside him hesitated. She wasn't pleading for forgiveness. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. She simply stood there, tense and exhausted, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times but still wasn't prepared for it. "You expect me to believe that?" His voice was cold, but there was an edge of something else beneath it. "That you were kidnapped? That for 3 years, you had no way to contact me? No way to let me or Sarah know that you were alive?" Catherine inhaled deeply, gripping her arms as if trying to steady herself. "I know how it sounds, Jonathan. And I don't blame you for doubting me. But I swear to you, I didn't leave by choice." He wanted to argue, to call her a liar, to remind her of every night Sarah had cried herself to sleep, asking why her mother didn't love her enough to stay. But then Catherine reached into her bag, pulling out a small envelope. "Here," she said, extending it toward him. "If you don't believe me, maybe this will help." Jonathan hesitated before snatching the envelope from her hand. He tore it open, pulling out a collection of photographs. His fingers tightened around the edges as he flipped through them, his stomach twisting. They were grainy, taken in dim lighting, but the subject was unmistakable. Catherine. In every single photo, she looked different from the woman standing before him now. Her hair had been cut shorter, her face was thinner, her eyes hollowed with exhaustion. Some photos showed her in a dingy room with concrete walls, sitting on a cot, staring blankly ahead. Others showed her in an unfamiliar house, washing dishes, her expression vacant. Jonathan's hands shook slightly as he turned to the last photo. It was of her, sitting at a table, a man standing behind her, his hand gripping her shoulder too tightly. The expression on her face sent a chill through him. She looked utterly defeated, as if hope had long since left her. His throat tightened. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual fire. "The last 3 years of my life," she said softly. "I was taken by people who knew exactly who you were, Jonathan. They knew you had money, power, influence. And they knew that if they used me, they could use you." Jonathan clenched his jaw, his mind spinning. "If they wanted money, why didn't they contact me? Why didn't they ransom you?" Catherine hesitated, lowering her gaze. "Because it wasn't about money." His chest tightened. "Then what was it about?" She took a slow, shaky breath. "Control. Revenge. I don't know the full extent of it, but I know they had ties to some of your business rivals. They wanted leverage. And when they realized they could use me to hurt you without ever having to contact you, they did." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. He had dealt with corporate enemies, with people who wanted to see him fail, but this was something darker. He had thought he understood the cutthroat nature of the business world, but this was beyond ruthless. "You're telling me that for 3 years, You were kept prisoner, and I never knew? She nodded. I tried to escape twice. The first time, they caught me before I made it past the gate. The second time, I nearly made it to a police station before they dragged me back. Her voice broke slightly, and she wrapped her arms around herself. They made sure I had no way to contact you. No phone, no internet access, nothing. I was completely cut off. Jonathan felt sick. He had spent years believing that she had left by choice, cursing her name in the dark while Sarah cried in the next room. And now he was standing here, realizing that the truth was something far worse than he had ever imagined. Why now? He asked, his voice rough. How did you get away? Catherine exhaled. There was a man, one of them. He had a change of heart. He knew what they were doing was wrong. He helped me escape, gave me just enough time to get on a plane before they could stop me. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything. He had been so sure, so convinced that she had chosen to leave them. Now, he didn't know what to think. He looked at her, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate deception. But all he saw was the weight of 3 stolen years reflected in her tired eyes. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could hate her anymore. Jonathan stood in stunned silence, gripping the photographs so tightly that the edges began to bend under the pressure of his fingers. The weight of Catherine's words pressed down on him, twisting everything he thought he knew about the past 3 years into something unrecognizable. He had spent so much time convincing himself that she had walked away, that she had chosen to abandon them. But now, looking at the evidence in his hands, he realized that the truth was far more horrifying than anything he had ever imagined. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to regain control. His emotions were a storm raging inside him: anger, guilt, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite name. He wanted to demand more answers, to question every detail of her story, but the exhaustion in her eyes made him hesitate. If what she was saying was true, she had already lived through hell. Why didn't I know? His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. Why didn't anyone find you? Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, shifting her weight slightly as if the memories were too heavy to carry. Because they made sure you wouldn't, she said. They were careful, Jonathan. They never left a trace. They never sent a ransom demand because they didn't want money. They wanted you to suffer. They wanted you to think I left willingly because they knew that would hurt more. His stomach twisted. It made sense in a sick, twisted way. If they had contacted him, if they had made demands, he would have known she was alive. He would have fought for her. Instead, they had chosen silence, chosen to let him believe she had disappeared of her own accord, knowing that the pain of abandonment would leave deeper scars than any physical threat ever could. Jonathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And Sarah? His voice dropped, rough with emotion. Did they ever threaten her? Catherine's expression darkened, and for the first time, he saw something else in her eyes: pure, unfiltered rage. They used her against me, she admitted. Whenever I fought back, whenever I refused to comply, they would remind me that they knew where she was. They would tell me that if I tried to escape again, something might happen to her. I didn't even know if it was true, but I couldn't take that risk. Jonathan felt a surge of fury so intense that it nearly consumed him. Someone had used his daughter as a weapon. Someone had taken Catherine and manipulated her by dangling the possibility of harm to their child over her head. His hands curled into fists, his entire body tense with barely restrained rage. He wasn't just angry at the people who had done this. He was angry at himself. He had believed the worst about Catherine when he should have questioned everything. He had let his own pain cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had let Sarah grow up believing that her mother had left them by choice. His chest tightened. She thinks you abandoned her, he admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. She cried for you for months, and when I couldn't give her an answer, I let her believe that you didn't love us anymore. Catherine's face crumpled, and for the first time, he saw her truly break. A strangled sob escaped her lips as she pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head in silent denial. I never wanted that, she whispered. I never wanted her to think that I didn't love her. She was all I thought about every single day. She was the only thing that kept me from giving up. Jonathan's throat felt tight. The logical part of him was still struggling to accept all of this, still screaming for more proof, more time to process. But the father in him, the man who had spent years trying to pick up the pieces of a broken family, knew that Sarah deserved the truth. She deserved to know that her mother hadn't left her by choice. But how could he tell her? How could he make a 6-year-old understand something so horrific? He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to focus. What do you want, Catherine? His voice was steady now, but there was an edge to it, a warning that he wasn't willing to let her destroy their lives again. Why come back now? Catherine met his gaze, her expression raw but determined. Because I need to fix this, she said. I need Sarah to know the truth. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect her to forgive me. But I need to try. Jonathan studied her carefully. There was no desperation in her voice, no hidden agenda. She wasn't here to beg for a second chance. She was here for their daughter. And that was the only reason he didn't walk away. She's not ready to see you, he admitted. Not yet. I need time to figure out how to explain this to her. Catherine nodded, though the pain in her eyes was clear. I understand. Jonathan exhaled. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, he admitted. But Sarah deserves the truth. Catherine swallowed hard. That's all I want. He wasn't sure if he believed that. He wasn't sure if he believed anything anymore. But one thing was clear, his world had just been turned upside down, and no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. Jonathan had spent years mastering control. In the corporate world, control was his greatest strength, the thing that made him the powerhouse CEO everyone respected and feared. But standing outside that restaurant, staring at the woman he had once loved, the woman he had grieved, the woman he had hated, he realized that control meant nothing here. Nothing could have prepared him for this moment. He had always believed in facts, in logic. Catherine had left. She had abandoned their daughter. Those had been the facts for the past 3 years, the truth he had built his life around. But now, that truth had shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the selfish, heartless person he had painted her to be. She was broken, scarred in ways he couldn't yet understand, carrying a weight that he hadn't even begun to grasp. He still didn't know if he believed her. The photographs were real, the pain in her voice was real, but part of him still resisted the idea that everything he had known was a lie. But Sarah was what mattered now. She had spent 3 years believing her mother didn't love her. He had let her believe that because, at the time, he had believed it too. But if Catherine was telling the truth, if she really had been taken, then everything Sarah knew about her mother was wrong. And he didn't know how to fix that. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. You can't just walk back into her life, Catherine, he said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. She's 6 years old. She's finally starting to heal from what you leaving did to her. I'm not going to let you destroy that. Catherine nodded, though he could see the way his words cut her. I understand, she said. I don't want to hurt her, Jonathan. I just want a chance to be in her life again. Jonathan clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming at him to shut this down, to tell her that she had lost that right the moment she walked out of their lives. But that wasn't the truth anymore, was it? If she had been taken, if she had been a prisoner for 3 years, then she hadn't chosen to leave. And that changed everything. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to tell her. I don't even know if I should. Catherine hesitated before stepping forward slightly. Let me help, she said. Please. I know I can't just show up and expect her to accept me. But maybe we can start small. Maybe I can be someone she gets to know again, slowly, on her terms. Jonathan studied her, weighing her words carefully. It went against every protective instinct he had, every part of him that had spent years shielding Sarah from pain. But was keeping the truth from her really protecting her? Or was it just protecting himself from the risk of trusting Catherine again? He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said finally. "We do this my way. We take it slow. And the second I feel like this is too much for her, it stops." Relief flooded Catherine's face, and she nodded quickly. "Of course. Whatever she needs." Jonathan hesitated for a moment, still unsure if he was making the right decision, then pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for, a picture of Sarah, taken just a few weeks ago. She was standing in their backyard, holding the school award that had brought them to this restaurant tonight, her bright blue eyes filled with pride. He turned the phone toward Catherine, watching as she inhaled sharply, her fingers hovering near the screen as if she wanted to touch it but couldn't. "She's beautiful," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "She's grown so much." Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah. She has." Catherine wiped at her eyes quickly, then straightened. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she said. "Even if it takes years, even if she never fully forgives me, I just want her to know that I never stopped loving her." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her, wasn't sure if he could ever truly believe that what had happened wasn't somehow her fault. But Sarah deserved the truth, and for now, that was the only thing that mattered. "We'll see," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "One step at a time." Catherine nodded, and for the first time that night, something in her expression shifted. It wasn't relief or sadness or even regret. It was hope. Jonathan had always believed that time healed wounds, but now he wasn't so sure. 3 years had passed since Catherine had disappeared, and in that time, he had convinced himself that he and Sarah had moved on, that they had built a life without her. But in the days following their conversation outside the restaurant, he realized that the past was not as buried as he had once believed. The moment Catherine returned, everything changed. He spent the next few nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to tell Sarah the truth. The idea of her mother being back, of her not having abandoned them by choice, was too big to simply drop on her. Sarah was smart, more perceptive than most 6-year-olds. She asked questions when things didn't make sense. She saw things that others missed. He knew that if he handled this the wrong way, it could shatter the fragile stability they had built over the years. By the time the weekend arrived, he still didn't have the perfect answer. But he couldn't avoid it any longer. He had promised Catherine that they would do this on Sarah's terms, and that started with telling her the truth. That Saturday morning, he sat Sarah down in the living room, his hands clasped together as he searched for the right words. She was curled up on the couch, hugging her favorite stuffed rabbit, her bright blue eyes watching him with curiosity. "Daddy?" she asked, tilting her head. "Why do you look nervous?" Jonathan exhaled, forcing himself to smile, though his chest felt tight. "Because there's something I need to tell you, sweetheart. Something important." Sarah's expression grew serious, and she sat up a little straighter. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's about your mom." For a second, there was nothing but silence. Sarah blinked, processing his words, before her small fingers tightened around the rabbit in her lap. "I thought we didn't talk about her anymore," she said quietly. Jonathan's heart ached. He had never told Sarah she couldn't talk about Catherine, but over time, she had simply stopped asking. He had assumed it was because she had let go. Now he wasn't so sure. "I know," he said gently. "And I'm sorry for that. But I need to tell you something. Something I didn't know before." Sarah frowned. "What is it?" Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, choosing his words carefully. "I always thought that when your mom left, she did it because she didn't want to be with us anymore. But that's not true. She didn't leave us by choice. She was taken." Sarah's brows furrowed. "Taken? Like kidnapped?" Jonathan nodded, watching as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. He could see the gears turning in her head, the way she was piecing things together. So, she didn't want to leave? Sarah asked hesitantly. No, Jonathan said. She wanted to be with us. She wanted to be with you. But she couldn't. And now she's back. Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at him, as if waiting for him to say he was joking. She's back, she echoed. Jonathan nodded slowly. She wants to see you. But only if you're ready. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She looked down at the rabbit in her hands, tracing her fingers over its worn ears. He could see the war inside her, the confusion, the doubt, the hope she was trying to suppress. She didn't forget about me, she finally whispered. Jonathan's chest tightened. No, sweetheart, he said softly. She never forgot about you. She never stopped loving you. Sarah swallowed hard, and for a moment, he thought she might cry. But instead, she lifted her head, her expression more determined than he had ever seen it. I want to see her, she said. I want to know if she's really my mom. Jonathan nodded, his throat thick with emotion. Okay, he said. We'll take it slow. You don't have to rush into anything. Sarah nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told him she had already made up her mind. Jonathan knew that no matter how much he wanted to protect her from pain, this was a moment she needed to have. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, their family could find a way to heal. Jonathan had never felt this kind of nervousness before. He had closed billion-dollar deals, faced ruthless competitors, and handled crisis after crisis in the corporate world, but none of that compared to the uncertainty of what was about to happen. Sarah had made her decision. She wanted to see Catherine. Now, it was Jonathan's job to make sure that meeting didn't break her heart all over again. The next afternoon, he drove Sarah to a quiet park just outside the city. It was a place she loved, one of their usual weekend spots, where she would run through the grass and play on the swings while he sat nearby with his laptop. Today, though, there was no playfulness in her. She sat in the back seat, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly, her small hands clenched around its soft body. She hadn't spoken much since they left the house, and Jonathan hadn't pushed her. He knew she was processing, trying to prepare herself for what she was about to face. Catherine was already there when they arrived. She stood near one of the benches, her posture stiff, her hands gripping the strap of her purse like it was the only thing keeping her steady. When she saw the car pull up, she exhaled visibly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as if trying to make herself look more presentable. Jonathan turned to Sarah. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Sarah swallowed and nodded, though he could see the hesitation in her eyes. "What if she doesn't like me?" she asked suddenly, her voice small. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "That's not possible," he said. "She loves you. She always has." Sarah took a deep breath, then pushed open the car door. Jonathan stepped out with her, keeping close as they walked toward Catherine. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of 3 years pressing down on all of them. Catherine's eyes were locked on Sarah. She looked like she wanted to run to her, to scoop her up and hold her, but she didn't move. She waited. She let Sarah set the pace. "Hi," Catherine said softly. Sarah studied her for a long moment, her small brows furrowing slightly. "You look different," she said finally. Catherine let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I know. You do too. You've grown so much." Sarah hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "You were gone for a long time," she said, her voice careful, testing. Catherine nodded again, her eyes glassy with emotion. "I was. And I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never wanted to leave. I wanted to be with you every single day." Sarah looked down at her rabbit, tracing her fingers over its ears. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine inhaled sharply, her whole body trembling. "Oh, sweetheart, no," she said, taking a small step closer. "That's not true. That was never true. I love you more than anything in the world. I thought about you every single day. I missed you so much it hurt." Sarah lifted her gaze, searching Catherine's face as if trying to figure out whether or not to believe her. Then, after a long pause, she held out the stuffed rabbit. "You gave this to me," she said, "before you left." Catherine let out a quiet sob, pressing a hand to her mouth before reaching out to gently touch the rabbit's worn fur. "I remember," she whispered. "You named her Rosie." Sarah nodded. "I kept her with me every night. I didn't want to forget you." Catherine wiped her tears quickly. "I never forgot you, baby. Not for 1 second." Sarah hesitated for another long moment. Then, slowly, cautiously, she took a step forward. "Can I hug you?" she asked. Catherine let out a broken breath, nodding furiously. "Of course," she whispered. Sarah closed the space between them, wrapping her small arms around Catherine's waist. Catherine sank to her knees, holding her tightly, her face buried in her daughter's hair as quiet sobs shook her shoulders. Jonathan stood back, watching the moment unfold, his own emotions caught somewhere between relief and heartache. He had spent so long believing that Catherine had abandoned them, had spent so long convincing himself that Sarah was better off without her. But now, as he watched their daughter cling to the mother she had lost, he realized that maybe, just maybe, she had needed this all along. And maybe, so had he. Jonathan had always believed that healing took time, but watching Sarah and Catherine together made him realize that sometimes healing started in a single moment. The hug between mother and daughter was more than just an embrace, it was 3 years of pain, confusion, and unanswered questions melting away into something neither of them had known they needed. He had expected Sarah to be hesitant, to keep her distance, to need time to process everything. But instead, she clung to Catherine like she was afraid to let go, as if releasing her would make her disappear again. Jonathan knew that feeling all too well. He had. The drive home was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. Sarah sat in the back seat, hugging her stuffed rabbit close to her chest, her eyes distant as if she was still trying to process everything that had just happened. Jonathan stole a few glances at her through the rearview mirror, watching as her small fingers absent-mindedly traced the seams of the worn fabric. She wasn't crying, she wasn't upset, but he could tell she was deep in thought. Catherine had stayed behind at the park after they left, giving Sarah the space she needed. It had been her idea, and Jonathan had agreed. He knew this couldn't be rushed. It had to be Sarah's decision, her choice on how much or how little she wanted her mother to be part of her life now. Jonathan wasn't sure how he felt about any of it yet. He had spent 3 years building a world where Catherine no longer existed, and now, in the span of a single day, everything had changed. When they got home, Sarah walked straight to the couch, curling up in the corner with Rosie tucked under her chin. Jonathan sat beside her, giving her time, letting her take the lead. He wasn't going to push. She needed to process this in her own way. After a few moments of silence, she finally spoke. "She smells the same." Jonathan frowned slightly, not sure what she meant. "What?" Sarah glanced up at him, her expression soft but serious. "Mommy. When she hugged me, she smelled the same. Like flowers. I think I almost forgot what she smelled like." Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected that. "Is that a good thing?" he asked carefully. Sarah nodded slowly. "I think so." She was quiet for a moment before shifting to face him more directly. "Do you think she'll stay this time?" Jonathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. That was the question he wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I think she wants to." Sarah considered that, chewing on her bottom lip. "She said she didn't leave on purpose," she said softly. "Do you believe her?" Jonathan hesitated, his own emotions still tangled in ways he hadn't fully worked through. "I don't know," he admitted again. But I know she loves you. And I know she's trying. Sarah nodded, looking down at her rabbit. I think I want to see her again. Jonathan wasn't surprised. He had seen the way Sarah had held onto Catherine at the park, the way she had buried her face in her mother's shoulder as if she was trying to remember what it felt like. No matter what had happened, no matter how much time had passed, Sarah was still just a little girl who had missed her mother. Okay, he said gently. We'll figure it out together. A small smile tugged at Sarah's lips. Can we bring her cookies next time? Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You just want an excuse to bake, don't you? Sarah grinned. Maybe. Jonathan reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then cookies it is. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Jonathan stood in the doorway of her room, watching her breathe softly, Rosie still clutched tightly in her arms. He had spent 3 years believing he was doing the right thing by keeping the past buried, by protecting Sarah from the pain of her mother's absence. But now, watching her sleep, knowing that she had found even the smallest piece of peace today, he wondered if he had been wrong. Catherine had broken him once. She had left wounds that had taken years to heal. But this wasn't about him. This was about Sarah. And if there was even a chance that she could have both of her parents in her life, that she could finally have the answers she deserved, then Jonathan knew he had to try. As he walked back to his room, he pulled out his phone and hesitated for only a moment before sending a message. We'll be at the park next Saturday. Sarah wants to see you again, ****. A few seconds later, Catherine's response came through. Thank you. Jonathan stared at the message for a long moment before setting his phone down. He wasn't sure what the future held, wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive Catherine, wasn't sure if they could ever be a family again. But for the first time in 3 years, he was willing to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The ending of this story is powerful because it doesn't offer a neatly tied-up resolution, it offers something much more real, the beginning of healing. Instead of forcing a dramatic reconciliation or a complete return to the past, it acknowledges that some wounds take time to mend, and trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Jonathan's journey is one of transformation. For years, he believed that Catherine had abandoned them, and that belief shaped the way he raised Sarah. He thought he was protecting her by shutting out the past, by making sure she never had to feel the pain of rejection again. But in reality, he had been protecting himself. When faced with the truth, he had to make the hardest decision, not just to allow Catherine back into Sarah's life, but to allow the possibility of forgiveness, however difficult it might be. Sarah's perspective is perhaps the most heartbreaking yet hopeful part of the story. She is young, innocent, and full of love, but she has also carried the weight of her mother's absence. Unlike Jonathan, she doesn't see things through the lens of betrayal or logic, she sees them through the lens of a child who just wants to be loved. Her willingness to open her heart, despite the years of pain, is what ultimately pushes Jonathan toward giving Catherine a chance. Catherine, on the other hand, is not presented as a perfect victim or an idealized mother. She is deeply flawed, carrying guilt, pain, and the weight of everything she lost. She doesn't demand forgiveness, she understands that it must be earned. Her patience, her restraint, and her commitment to making things right show that she has changed. But whether or not she and Jonathan can rebuild what they once had is left open-ended, and that's what makes the story feel authentic. The final message is clear: healing is not instant, and love, especially broken love, requires effort. Trust takes time to rebuild, and sometimes it may never fully return. But what matters is the willingness to try. Jonathan doesn't forgive Catherine overnight, and he may never completely let go of the pain she caused, but he makes a choice, for Sarah, for himself, and for the possibility of a different future. The best endings don't provide easy answers, they provide hope. And in this story, hope is enough.